Spoke about this today. It's about actions. And so how one evaluates one's counterparts sitting across the table from them is important to think about how you can find common understandings in progress. But in the end, it's not about what someone says or the agreement that they sign, but are they prepared to lead, to do the things that they committed to? Are they prepared to fulfill their promises? And we've watched this China walk away for their promises to the world on Hong Kong. We watched General Secretary Xi promised President Obama in the Rose Garden in 2015 that he wouldn't militarize the South China Sea. Google the South China Sea and arms. You'll see another promise broken. So in the end, from my perspective, it's much more important to watch how leaders behave and how they lead than what it is you think when you have a chance to talk to them on the phone or meet them in person.
Mr. Secretary said this is not containment. I heard that very clearly. I have read the three previous speeches by Ambassador O'Brien, Director Wray, Attorney General Barr, and now listening to you very closely. It isn't containment, but it is a fairly comprehensive, multidimensional, relentlessly objective candor. Is that dangerous in a world that's not used to speaking clearly about delicate subjects?
You know, my experience, and I think President Trump's experience too, in his life as a businessman, is the best policy is always true candor. Identifying the places that you have a red line, identifying places that you have a real interest, making clear if there's places where you don't, there's things that you can work on alongside each other. I think the real danger comes from misunderstandings and miscommunication and the failure to be honest about the things that matter to you, because others will move into that space and then conflict arises. I think the world is a heck of a lot safer when you have leaders who are prepared to be honest about the things that matter and prepared to talk about the things their nation is prepared to do to secure those interests. And you can reduce risk by these conversations so long as you're honest about it. So I don't think it's dangerous. I think it's just honest.
You also said, and I'm sure the speech will be known as the distrust but verify speech. When you distrust but verify, that still premises verification is possible. It is still possible to do agreements and to verify them, correct?
It is. Yeah, you can still do it. Each nation's got to be prepared for a certain amount of intrusiveness connected to that. And it is not in the nature of communist regimes to allow transparency inside of their country. And so it's been done before. We had arms controls agreements with the Soviet Union, and we got verification that was sufficient to ensure that we protected American interests. I believe we can do it again. I hope that we can do this on these. The Chinese Communist Party has several hundred nuclear warheads. This is a serious global power. To the extent we can find common ground, a common set of understandings to reduce risk, if there's ever a really bad day for the world, we ought to do it. It's going to require agreement and verification.
Ambassador Richard Haas, who is now chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, said very recently, it may have been yesterday, it might have been this morning, I saw it this morning preparing, quote, Secretary Pompeo doesn't speak of China, but of the Chinese Communist Party if there is a China, as if there were a China apart from the party. This is meant to antagonize and make diplomacy impossible. Quite a stance for America's chief diplomat to take unless his goal is to ensure diplomacy fails. Is that your goal?
Goodness. Where to begin? Here's where I'll begin. It's a bit patronizing to the people of China to make such an assertion that they're not free-thinking beings, that they're not rational people who were given, they too were made in the image of God, right? They have all the capacity that anybody in the world does. So to somehow think that we ought to ignore the voices of the people of China seems to me the wrong approach. It is true. The Chinese Communist Party is a one-party rule thing. And so we will deal with the Chinese Communist Party as the head of state for China, and we need to engage in dialogue. But it seems to me we would dishonor ourselves and the people of China if we ignored them.
Now, Ambassador O'Brien, whose speech you referenced, put heavy emphasis on the ideology of Marxist-Leninism. It was almost quaint to hear that conversation again. It's gone from our vocabulary. Does the American people, and especially the American media, need to reacquaint itself with what Marxist-Leninists believe, because the CCP genuinely does believe it?
You know, I always get in trouble with you when I comment on the media. So I'll say this much. For those of us who have lived and seen and observed, there are other Marxist-Leninist nations today as well, and have seen, they believe, they have an understanding, a central understanding of how people interact and how societies ought to interact. And it is certainly the case today that the leadership in China believes that. We should acknowledge that, and we should make sure that we don't for a moment think that they don't believe it. That's what Ambassador O'Brien's speech was about. It was the fact it was acknowledging that they believe it and recognizing that we have to respond in a way that reflects our understanding of the way they view the world.
Let's not talk about the American media. I want to talk about the Chinese media for a moment. They are aggressive, to say the least. And right now they are aggressively defending, for example, TikTok. A small question within a large question. Is TikTok capable of being weaponized? Is that an example of what's going on? And generally, Chinese media has become far more aggressive than I've seen in 30 years since I was at the library the first time of watching it. Is that something you've noticed as well?
Yes, they're very aggressive. Two pieces to this. One, you hit upon. One is I'll describe as their technology media. Without singling out any particular business, our view of these companies is we're neither for or against the company. We're about making sure that we protect the information that belongs to each of you, your health records, your face, if it's a facial recognition software, your address, all the things that you carry that you want to make sure the Chinese Communist Party doesn't have. We have a responsibility to make sure that the systems that you're using don't give them access to that. So whether it's the efforts we made against Huawei or the work that we're doing on other software firms, the American task is to protect the American people and their information. The second piece of this has to do with their what I call the state-sponsored media of China and their disinformation. You should know, and this is where I am concerned about the American media too. These are state-sponsored media organizations that take their messaging from the Chinese Communist Party each day. When American institutions pick up those storylines and carry them forward, they are in fact propagating Chinese propaganda. And we all ought to be wise to that. There was an editorial in the New York Times yesterday by someone who had a clear view that was antithetical to the American way of life. The New York Times ran it straight up without comment, forwarding, although albeit in the opinion section, but propagating Chinese propaganda. That is certainly not instructive when they're telling senators from Arkansas they can't simply talk about American freedom in that same media outlet.
You mentioned that a lot of corporate America, and you mentioned specifically Hollywood, have got deep intertwinement with the Chinese economy. So I don't want to talk about soft power, I want to talk about soft appeasement. One of my favorite sports figures, LeBron James, falls silent when China comes up. In the new Top Gun movie, the Taiwan and Japanese patches are taken off Maverick's jacket. They're not going to be in Top Gun 2, they were in Top Gun 1. What do you say, not to those individuals, but to everyone who has an American spotlight about their responsibility to be candid about the People's Republic of China?
Here's our ask. Our ask is, if you claim that you care about human rights or social justice or these things, if you make that part of your corporate theology, then you ought to be consistent. And you can't be consistent if you're operating there in China without talking about and acknowledging what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in certain parts of their country, the oppression that's taking place. Look, every business leader has got to make decisions for themselves. They've got to be able to live with the decisions that they make. You highlighted a few. I'd simply ask this. If you run an entity and the United States government were to tell you you couldn't do something, put a particular symbol in your movie or put a particular name on your menu, if we were to tell you that, you'd say, nope, that's not appropriate, and it, of course, would not be appropriate. It seems to me that if you permit the Chinese Communist Party to limit you in that way, it's got to be difficult for you to go home at night.
Two more questions, Mr. Secretary. Because it is hot, and it is warm, and everyone out here has been in the sun for a while. You're a West Point graduate, and as Governor Wilson noted, #1, so this might be tough for you, but we are like Athens was a naval power, America is a naval power, and as like Sparta is, China is a land power. Do we not have to change how we approach defense spending to put more emphasis on our naval resources than on our Army resources?
Oh, that's tough for an Army guy to say.
I know.
You're killing me. Look, I'll leave the Secretary Esper the details of this. But here's what I can say. When President Trump set out our national security strategy early on in the administration, for the first time, we identified China in a way that was fundamentally different than we had done, this isn't partisan, for decades. That was important because that was a signal to all of us, whether it's the State Department or the Defense Department, that we need to reorient our assets. And so, yes, you've seen the Department of Defense begin to do that. These are big things to turn. These budgets are multi-year. It takes a while. But if you look at how Secretary Esper and President Trump are positioning our military capabilities, not just the tactical, operational, strategic capabilities, but our cyber capabilities, our space capabilities. If you look at how we're thinking about this and spending resources in year 2, 3, 4, and 5, I think you'll see that our focus has shifted pretty dramatically. It's not to say that our efforts to protect America from terrorism are behind us. We still have work to do there. But I think this great power challenge that presents itself is something that we have recognized, and we begin to make sure that we allocate your money, our taxpayer resources that we have, to the appropriate ends to achieve American security.
My last question has to do with the former Secretary of State, who was also an Army man, George Marshall. He gave a speech in 1947 at your alma mater, Harvard, in which he called on all the nations of the world to recognize that the world was in crisis and to choose a side. And he assured them in that famous address that if you chose the American side in asserting Europe, you could count on America. So as you make the appeal you did today, not just to Europe, where it's relatively easy to be outspoken, though Norway has found it not to be outspoken, but to Taiwan and Japan and Vietnam and all of the Australia, all of the nations of that region. And they rely on America in the way that people opposing the Soviet Union could rely on George Marshall's assurance in 1947.
Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly. The only thing I'll say is, this language of pick a side does make sense to me, but I think about picking a side differently than picking America or picking China. I think the sides, the division, the shirts and skins, if you will, is between freedom and tyranny. I think that's the decision that we're asking each of these nations to make. And here's the good news. The good news is it does take American leadership often in these cases. To your point, they need to know that America will be there for them. I've seen the tide turn. In just these 3.5 years of our administration, I've watched other nations have less timidity, become more prepared to stand up for their freedoms and for the freedoms of their people. We don't ask them to do this for America. We ask them to do it for their country and for their nation, the freedom and the independence and to protect the rights of their people. And when we do that and we tell them that America will be there, I'm very confident in the end that this is a world that with the hard work applied will become one that is governed by a rules-based order, and the freedom of the American people will be secured.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this historic address with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We'd like to invite you to relax, refresh, and cool off in the First Lady's Rose Garden and under the